But Time on the Cross was written by two northern professors, Robert William Fogel and Stanley L. Ingerman. They were professors of economics and history at the time of the writing of the book, and Professor Fogel taught at Harvard University. The book sent shockwaves through the academic world when it was published in the early 70s, 1974. And it still gives a wonderful shock when mentioned. And that's why I love to mention it at every opportunity. These two men did perhaps, or without question, the most thorough examination that has ever been done of plantation records. The owner of the plantation's personal record books. Now, the reason why they went through the plantation records was they believed that regardless of what a man might say publicly, the books, the bottom line, would tell the truth. We don't want to know what a man said for public consumption. We want to know exactly what his records show. How were his slaves treated? What kind of clothes did they wear? What kind of food did they eat? What kind of housing did they have? What about medical care? What about his treatment of them? What are the records, and what do the records say? They felt that that would be the most unbiased picture of the Southern institution. And again, these men are not favorable toward the South. They are not favorable toward slavery. And in their book, you will notice that they very much apologize for their findings. Was there cruelty, is the first question. And the thing that they wanted to concern was the methods of punishment. And their conclusion was this: though there were other forms of punishment used, the most common form of punishment was whipping. Some whippings were so severe they resulted in death. In other instances, which were by far the majority, the whippings were applied as mildly as corporal punishment is normally practiced within families. You must remember that the slaves were viewed as family members, especially among Christians. You always chasten your children. I spank mine, and if yours are in my house, they might get one too if they deserve it. That's the way we live. We believe that that's important. And so the Southern slave owner, Christian slave owner, was very concerned about the training and discipline of all of his children. That's the way he referred to his slaves. And so very often he himself would do it. He did not allow overseers to whip because he felt that their frustrations might be carried out. Many times the whipping was only allowed to be done in the presence of the slave, presence of the master. Many times the slaves themselves, as a slave jury, determined how many whippings had to be given. And the master always, one man said, I always had to cut it by half. In other words, it was always too severe, the judgment of the slaves on themselves, on their offenders. The slave narratives are overwhelmingly favorable in the judgment of masters as good men. And I mean by that is, I've read approximately 40% of the slave testimonies. It is a very wide sample, much more, I would say, wider than most samples taken in common polls. And I have a list of conclusions from that. And I only counted a testimony if they specifically mentioned the nature of the master and his treatment. Now, many times slaves would say things like, it was a wonderful time in slave days. I had a wonderful time. Now, I assume by that statement they weren't mistreated, but I didn't count them because they didn't say they weren't mistreated. You see? So I try to get a very conservative kind of number. Now, 86% of those that I read said that they were never mistreated, that their masters were very kind and loving, granting many privileges, and they loved them and love them still. Now, quite a few, as I mentioned, would not allow whipping at all, and only allowed it very mildly and only in their presence. Far more important, you see, than whipping was managing the slave, and managing the slaves was trying to motivate them. You see, you have to understand again that no plantation owner wanted slaves that were sullen and discontented and hostile, as you could have been if you're mistreating them. You see, let's get honest. Even if I'm not a Christian, Christians obviously were concerned about how they treated their slaves. But even if I'm not a Christian, I've got a lot of money invested in these people. I do not want them angry with me. I do not want them sabotaging the plantation. And there were literally thousands of ways that slaves could sabotage the intricate system of a plantation. If you upset one of them, they could destroy thousands of dollars. I mean, you could lose thousands of dollars. Even if I'm not a Christian, I am concerned about my money. I'm concerned about my investment. And that alone kept many men from mistreating slaves because they knew what slaves could do to sabotage the work of the plantation. You don't want sullen, discontented, angry, and hostile men working for you. Rather, you want happy, honest, responsible men who identify their fortunes with yours. And so what you want to do is to win their confidence and win their affection. The problem that Southerners had was motivating and encouraging. They did not do by and large, a great deal of negative punishment because they were afraid of the reaction. There were too many ways to do you wrong. So to achieve the desired response, planners developed a wide-ranging system of rewards. Some rewards were directed toward improving the short-run performance, so they'd have contests. Whoever gets through the row fastest wins an extra piece of lunch or something. There's little contests like that, and so they would have these races. They'd have corn shucking contests. They'd have all kinds of things. The prizes for the individual or the particular crew that worked together range from anything from clothing to tobacco to whiskey, but most often cash. When slaves worked times that were normally set aside for rest, they received extra pay. Most slaves in the South were paid at some point or another for their work. Occasionally, planners even devised elaborate schemes for profit sharing among their slaves. It was just like a factory almost, where you encourage and motivate your workers by saying, if we have a good crop, all of you get rewards. And that's what they did. It was rather elaborate, and the formula were all in the books, and they were written out. Now, all this evidence points to the fact that slaves lived at various levels of income. The average pecuniary income actually received by a prime field hand was roughly 15% greater than the income he would have received for his labor as a free agricultural worker, which is why most of the Southern non-slave owners were very much opposed to slavery. They didn't feel like it was fair to them. Occasionally, some slaves saved their money and were quite wealthy after the war. Simon Phillips, a slave from Alabama, says this: "People has the wrong idea of slave days. We was treated good. My master never laid a hand on me the whole time I was with him, and sometime we loaned him money when he was hard pushed." As far as the freemen in the South, and there were quite a few freemen, many slaves purchased their freedom, and a lot of them were encouraged to do that very thing, which is something, again, you don't hear. The data in the 1850 census suggests that the economic condition of the average free northern Negro may have been worse than that of the average free southern Negro. A comparison between New York and New Orleans reveals that New York Negroes lived in more crowded housing, had a lower proportion of craftsmen, less wealth per capita than free Negroes in New Orleans. Nearly every slave in the South enjoyed a higher standard of living than the poor whites in the South. And they had a much easier existence. Most slaves worked under the task system, which allowed a great deal of flexibility in your work. And usually, in other words, you had a specific task to accomplish, and it didn't matter when you accomplished it so much as it had to be accomplished this day. If you could do it in a couple hours, you were finished. You finished your task. Sometimes it would take 8 hours, sometimes it would take 4 hours, and the average task took between 3 and 5 hours. It didn't take you all day long. They'll talk about working from sun to sun up to sundown. But in fact, white masters got up at sunup and went to bed at sundown. Everybody, by and large in the South, worked the same way. The average slave owner, of course, got up with his slaves, went to the field with his slaves, ate lunch with his slaves, and sometimes slept in the same room with his slaves in the evening because they all lived in the same house. So that was not unusual. But normally, and Forrest McDonald, historian at the University of Alabama, says this, normally these tasks were light enough that a worker could complete them in 3 to 4 hours. His time was his own when his task was done. And it was not uncommon for slaves in their free time to work the acres that were uniformly allotted to them by their masters and thereby allowed to accumulate personal property. In fact, if I can stop for a moment, every slave that I have read of had a private plot that was given to him by his master on which he grew vegetables, and the master bought the vegetables from the slave. Now, you see, in my mind, I thought, look, he could legitimately